Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. So, Mark, we are taping this episode on February 3rd, 2023. Yesterday was Groundhog Day.
Yes.
And I read in the newspaper that Punxsutawney Phil thinks there's going to be 6 more weeks of winter, but Staten Island Chuck, who's the local New York City groundhog, thinks there's going to be an early spring. So I'm troubled by this and wondering, what is this world coming to if our groundhogs can't even agree on the weather?
It is troubling. I agree. Maybe we need a cage match resolution to this. 2 groundhogs enter, 1 groundhog leaves, and we know who is the weather authority going forward.
You're the idea man, Mark. I knew I was good hands bringing that to you. I was thinking there might be a partisan bias with these groundhogs, because Staten Island is notoriously conservative and Punxsutawney is a suburb of Pittsburgh, and that's a liberal area. So I was thinking there might be some shenanigans there. In any case, I may have you look into that for a future episode of Mansplaining. But for now, we pivot to domestic politics, which is, as you know, is one of my favorite subjects. We haven't discussed it in a while. And my question for you this week is about statehood, particularly for the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. I don't think the United States has taken so long to admit new states in its entire history. It'll be 64 years this year. That's a long time. And I'm wondering, why isn't D.C. and Puerto Rico states already? So I had you look into this. And my question to you is there a good case to make for admitting D.C. and Puerto Rico? And what is the likelihood of it happening anytime soon? What did you find?
Well, as always, thank you for the question. In a way, this is a simple question with a simple answer. But if you go a little deeper and scratch beneath the surface, you can find some interesting wrinkles. So let's start with the basics. Before we ask how Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. might become states, so let's look at how states can be added to the U.S. in the first place. And as you noted in your question, it's been quite a while since we've done that. In 1959, Alaska and Hawaii were added as the 49th and 50th states. So it's been, as you said, 64 years since the last time a state was added to the Union. And that is, in fact, the largest gap of time in our nation's history. But in addition to Hawaii and Alaska, there were 3 other U.S. states added during the 20th century. Can you name them?
Arizona is definitely one of them, because I think that was the 48th state.
You are correct.
I don't know the other 2, but I'm guessing they're going to be out in the same general region, west or southwest, so maybe Nevada, New Mexico, something like that.
That's a good guess. New Mexico was, in fact, one of the other states. Both New Mexico and Arizona were added in 1912. The other state was Oklahoma, which became a state in 1907. Prior to becoming U.S. states, these were all governed as territories that were administered by a governor appointed by the federal government. And when I first started looking into this question, I assumed that adding a new state would be similar to amending the U.S. Constitution. It would take an act of Congress, and then the legislation would need to be ratified by 2/3 of the states. But it turns out I was only half right. The Constitution is actually pretty vague about the process. It simply grants Congress the right to create new states, with no ratification required. So in most cases, it's surprisingly easy to create a new state. And you could say that this is the only irreversible part of the Constitution. An amendment can be repealed and a law can be stricken down, but once a new state is added, there's no mechanism for getting rid of it. It's a part of the U.S. forever. And yet all it takes is an act of Congress and the signature of the president.
Interesting. And this is indeed one of the questions I was going to put to you, whether if this is a constitutional amendment or just legislation, because I didn't know the answer. So thank you for answering.
Personally, I suspect that the Founding Fathers didn't want to put any obstacles to the growth of the young country, since staying small might have been fatal if Britain or France decided to come back and try to take the colonies back over. But that's where we are, with a pretty vague and short description of the state-making process in the Constitution. And this fact almost immediately became controversial because of the way adding new states affects the balance of power in Congress. Prior to the Civil War, for example, there was a lot of jockeying when it came time to add slave states versus free states, since neither side wanted to give an electoral or congressional advantage to the other side.
Yes.
And there was an informal agreement in Washington that, as new states were added, every slave state would alternate with a new free state. That controversy lives on to this day, as we'll see in greater depth later on. In a few historical cases, Congress has passed a law that simply declares the existence of a new state. For example, in 1850, it passed the California Admission Act, and that was that. California was a new state. In other instances, Congress has passed what is called an Enabling Act, which sets forth a process which, once completed, culminates in the proclamation by the president of the new state. That's how Utah entered the United States in 1894. But generally speaking, adding a new state tends to be a three-step process. In step one, residents of the potential state signal their desire to join the U.S. by popular vote. In step two, both houses of Congress pass an act establishing the new state, which is then signed by the president. And in step three, that act is confirmed by a popular vote within the new state. Both Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., for the record, have taken the first step. They've held and passed popular votes indicating their desire to become new states. In the case of Washington, D.C., the vote was unambiguous. More than 80% of residents voted in favor. But the situation is more complicated in Puerto Rico, where there's a sizable opposition party that's opposed to statehood, composed of people who either want to remain a territory or who desire full independence from the U.S. The most recent vote in Puerto Rico was in 2020, when 52% of voters cast their vote in favor of statehood, with a 55% overall turnout. So we can say that there is a majority in favor of statehood there, although there's not really a big margin between yes or no on this question.
Yeah, and let me just jump in and say the 55% turnout rate is really surprising. I would think this is such a crucial issue for Puerto Rico. If there were one thing that would bring them all to the polls, it would be something that existential.
Yeah, though maybe you could jokingly suggest that one good reason for making Puerto Rico a state is that, like all other American states, they have trouble getting people to come out to the polls.
Right. I know that activists in Puerto Rico strongly believe in self-determination for the island.
Right.
So it would sure help if the folks showed up to the polls to determine it one way or the other. Don't you think?
Absolutely. In any case, we can say that step one is complete. And there is an argument to be made why we in the U.S. should want these territories to be states. When our country was coming together, new states were often added because they extended the territorial possessions of the U.S., or because they occupied strategic positions, or because there were economic incentives such as abundant natural resources to be gained by adding them. In this case, though, the argument in favor is primarily on moral grounds. That is simply the right thing to do. And there are a few reasons for this. The first can be found printed on license plates in Washington, D.C. The phrase, quote, "no taxation without representation."
Yes.
Residents of Washington, D.C. pay federal income taxes. Residents of Puerto Rico do not pay federal income taxes, but they do pay federal taxes on imports and exports, as well as Social Security and Medicare taxes. So it's a fair question to ask. If this country was originally formed because it was unjust for Britain to tax the colonies without giving them representation in Parliament, how is it not equally unjust to tax the residents of these two territories when they have no voting representatives in Congress?
Yes, that's as American a complaint as you could possibly have.
Indeed. And then there's the fact that residents of these territories serve in our armed forces. Puerto Ricans, in fact, have fought in every American war since 1898, the year that the territory was ceded to the U.S. at the end of the Spanish-American War. And they've been American citizens since 1917. So we allow them to die for this country, but we don't extend to them all the rights of American citizens, including representation in our government. As a territory rather than a state, some would argue that it's too easy for the needs of its people to be ignored by the federal government, as happened in 2017 when Hurricane Maria pummeled the island and the Trump administration did not seem particularly motivated to deliver aid to them. Puerto Ricans are not even allowed to vote in presidential elections unless they've emigrated to one of the other states. So it's an uncomfortable situation, and at least in the case of Puerto Rico, the situation has attracted popular attention. In a 2019 Gallup poll, 2 out of 3 Americans favored adding Puerto Rico as the 51st state. The issue enjoys strong support among Democrats and independents, and even Republicans are only marginally opposed to the idea. And 2 times in the past few years, Congress has taken steps towards creating these new states. In April of 2021, the House passed a bill in favor of statehood for D.C., but it never came to a vote in the Senate, and Senator Joe Manchin came out against the bill, effectively killing it. And then just a few months ago, a bill passed the House which would have instituted a binding referendum in Puerto Rico. If they voted for statehood, the federal government would have been obligated to follow suit. It has not been brought to the floor of the Senate for a vote. Where does the opposition to these measures come from? Outside of purely political considerations, what might give someone pause when considering statehood for these 2 territories? In the case of Puerto Rico, there's the matter of its very bad economic situation. The island is currently $70 billion in debt, unemployment is high, manufacturing jobs have disappeared, and the local government doesn't appear to have many answers. The island is on the verge of defaulting on its debt, so if Puerto Rico becomes a state, the debt would probably have to be assumed by the federal government, and after that there'd be the large question of how to lift the island out of its economic malaise. A complicating issue there is the fact that Puerto Rico's official language is Spanish, which some argue would complicate its population's full integration into the United States. So Puerto Rican statehood presents some real issues, but they do feel manageable. In the case of Washington, D.C., though, the landscape is considerably more thorny. First, opponents of statehood like to point out just how small the District of Columbia is. It's just over 68 square miles in size. Joe, can you name the smallest American state?
Rhode Island.
Boom. Right on that. You knew that immediately.
Yeah, but is it smaller or bigger than D.C.? I don't know that.
It is 1,045 square miles, so about 16 times as big as D.C. By population, D.C. is still small, but it's not as much of an outlier. As of 2022, there were about 672,000 residents of the district. Its population has been in decline in recent years and was over 700,000 in 2020. There are about 20 individual American cities that have higher population than the entire District of Columbia. It would not, however, be the smallest U.S. state by population.
Yes.
Can you name the 2 states that, as of 2022, had fewer than 672,000 inhabitants?
I can, and that's because I care about this issue and I pay attention. So it's Wyoming and Vermont.
Correct and correct. Vermont has 647,000 inhabitants, and Wyoming merely 581,000. So size isn't really that much of a deal breaker. But there are other questions that aren't as easily answered. First off, the District of Columbia was created specifically so that the federal government would not operate on land that was under the influence of one of the states, and it's designated as such in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. Before D.C. existed, the federal government met in Philadelphia, and when soldiers who were owed back pay camped outside their offices and demanded immediate payment, the governor of Pennsylvania refused to intervene, forcing federal officers to flee the city. Washington, D.C. exists specifically so that no future president will ever be similarly subject to the whims of a state government. In short, you can't just turn D.C. into a state. You need to separate the new state from the slivers of land on which the federal buildings and monuments reside. So something like how Vatican City exists as a tiny principality inside of Rome.
Yes, so you take like the Capitol, the White House, the Smithsonian Institution, right? All the federal properties, and you make that the capital, and then everything else could become a state.
Yeah.
Right?
Supreme Court, the monuments, that sort of thing.
Yeah, right.
But doing so does raise certain questions. For instance, what if some property developer in the new state decides to build a Chuck E. Cheese just across the street from the White House, or surround the Lincoln Memorial with glass and steel office buildings? Congress might no longer have the authority to prevent that sort of thing from happening. Or what if some future governor decides to exert leverage in a political squabble by cutting off the delivery of food, water, or electricity to the federal buildings? These scenarios might be little more than fear-mongering, but it is true that statehood for D.C. raises practical and logistical questions that we've never really needed to answer before.
You know, I had a hunch that Chuck E. Cheese was somehow undermining our democracy, but you've finally proven it to me.
Yeah. Well, you've heard the phrase cherchez la femme. I'm suggesting cherchez la Chuck E. Cheese.
Right.
And that's if statehood for D.C. is even constitutional, and some people would argue that it is not. In 1961, the 23rd Amendment granted D.C. 3 electoral votes. If the district becomes a state, what happens to those votes? It's not spelled out in the Constitution. Some people say that the votes can simply be taken off the board, while others argue that you'd need another amendment to close that loophole. And the district stands on land that was donated by the state of Maryland for use as a federal territory, and that land grant is described in Article 1, Section 8, with wording that suggests it was intended to be used in the same way for perpetuity. So can the district be made a state by simple act of Congress? Would that act require approval by the state of Maryland, or do you need another constitutional amendment?
And once you go there to constitutional amendment, then it becomes a real uphill climb, because that's so hard to pass an amendment.
A big old mess. Yeah. I found no consensus on these questions in the sources. You can find websites saying that statehood for D.C. is a simple and straightforward matter, and websites claiming that it is absolutely constitutionally prohibited. There seems to be no just general consensus. But one thing you can be sure of is no matter how you go about turning D.C. into a state, it would almost certainly end up in front of the Supreme Court.
I was just going to say that very thing. Anytime there's a difference of opinion like this, it's going to go to the Supremes. So the 6 Republicans who run our government will get to decide.
Mm-hmm. So you asked for my take on how likely it is that this will happen anytime soon. And on that question, the answer seems very clear. It is very, very unlikely to happen. Mitch McConnell has described the prospect of adding those new states as, quote, full-bore socialism, unquote, because it would change the balance of power in Congress. It's widely assumed that both states would be solidly blue. That fact might not much affect the balance of power in the House because the Reapportionment Act of 1929 capped the number of House representatives at 435, so new representatives for Puerto Rico and or Washington, D.C. would be added by taking away representatives from other states. The states which, as things stand today, would be most likely to lose members in the House are New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and Michigan. Those states collectively lean slightly Democratic, so it might be a zero-sum game in which blue votes are added for the new states at the cost of blue votes from other parts of the country.
Yes.
It's really hard to figure out.
Right. But that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned, because it disarms the weapon that Republicans use, that this is a blue state power grab. It isn't.
Except in the Senate. In the Senate, it's a very different matter.
Yeah.
Every state gets 2 senators. So adding both Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. as states would mean 4 additional Democratic votes and make it much easier for the Democratic Party to get a working majority in Congress. That's why Republican leaders hate the idea. If a bill to add one or both of these states is brought to the Senate, they would almost certainly deploy the filibuster. And as we've discussed in episode 27 of this podcast, it takes an almost unreachable 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. That's the sort of math that has Democrats advocating for the elimination of the filibuster.
Yeah.
But if that does happen someday, we all might end up regretting it. Since 2009, Democratic minorities have actually used the filibuster more often than Republicans have. And then, even if you find a way to get the legislation through both houses of Congress, it feels like a sure thing, as we've already discussed, that the matter would end up in front of the Supreme Court. How confident are we that the court's conservative and rather partisan majority will be inclined to give a permanent boost to the Democratic Party?
Right.
So in short, I don't see statehood happening. There's a better chance for Puerto Rico than Washington, D.C., because at least you don't have to amend the Constitution to make it happen, and because there's enough support within the Hispanic community that politicians like Marco Rubio might feel the need to support the cause. Still, it seems unlikely. What do you think?
I think it's unlikely in the short term. Very interesting how it may or may not require a constitutional amendment. I think that's really the crux of the matter, because anything that requires a constitutional amendment is dead in the water these days, as we proved during our ERA podcast,
Right.
Can't even get behind equal rights for women. There's no way we're going to get an amendment-sized majorities to do a statehood for these two places.
Yeah. And for the record, in 1982, a constitutional amendment passed both houses of Congress to give full representation for Washington, D.C. in the House and the Senate, but only 16 of the required 38 states ratified it within the time that it was provided.
Interesting.
So it was not popular in the states at all.
Yeah. To one of the points you made earlier about how the pre-Civil War pattern was to admit free state, slave state, free state, slave state, I did a little research on this subject, generally speaking, and there's been, political chicanery, I think it's fair to call it, has been part of the process of statehood, state admissions for well over 100 years.
Sure.
States like Colorado and the Dakotas were admitted on party line votes by Republican majorities to pad their own majority. And the Dakota Territory was broken up into North and South specifically so that there would be 4 Republican senators instead of 2. So what current Republicans feel is this smoking gun argument they have, that this is just a pure power grab. Well, the admission of all states is a pure power grab going back to before the Civil War. So I don't really think there's much integrity to that argument.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the state of play in Washington, D.C., not just today, but pretty much for our entire nation's history, is that you employ cynical political manipulations, and then you never describe those manipulations in cynical terms. You find the high-minded phrase to describe what is basically just maneuvering. Either side will happily employ those measures and then decry those measures when the other side attempts to do them. That's just the way things work.
Yeah, that's certainly true. But I also want to talk about the anti-majoritarian tendencies in the way the U.S. government was set up and is currently operating. So I'm sure you see the irony that what's standing in the way of removing what I would call a profoundly undemocratic institution, that being the 2 senators per state, whether you're a tiny state or a huge state. That's undemocratic, right? And what's standing in the way of removing that from being the scourge that I believe it is another profoundly undemocratic institution, the filibuster.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is another topic that we took up earlier on this podcast. We just keep circling back on ourselves, don't we?
Yeah.
Which is the fact that that's not an accidental outcome. That was deliberate. When this nation was first being formed, you had populous states like New York and Massachusetts, and then you had agrarian states like Virginia. And the representatives from the agrarian states built into the Constitution guarantees that their home states would not be dominated by the populous northern states, which a straight-up democracy would have resulted in. If you read the Federalist Papers, you see James Madison writing about the great scourge, which he describes as the tyranny of the majority.
Right.
And I think today, ironically, we're kind of suffering the tyranny of the minority. But since the minority was the one at that time that was forming the government, that's not the danger that they prepared for.
Yes, I mean, that's a well-said explanation of the history here. I just think we're stuck with the only techniques we have to use to make this country more majoritarian are these anti-democratic techniques, and they, by definition, inhibit any progress, and that's frustrating, but ironic.
Yeah, it certainly is.
I also want to talk more about some numbers. I didn't know how many numbers you were going to throw out, but you did mention how D.C. has more people than a couple of states of the Union. It would basically be the 48th most populous state. Puerto Rico has more people than 18 states.
Yeah, it's right in the middle.
Yeah. 3.1 million people, not a small place. But also, the statistics I keep coming back to when I think about this argument are things about like how the population of California is 80 times larger than that of Wyoming. So this one person, one vote is total bullshit because people in Wyoming, their votes are worth 80 times more than people in California.
Right.
In the last Congress, 50-50 Senate, right? The 50 Democratic senators represented almost 57% of voters in the country versus 43% represented by Republicans.
Right.
And that disparity is even worse now because the Democrats gained a seat in Pennsylvania this past November. And Pennsylvania is the 5th largest state. So that percentage of people represented by Democrats is getting up close to 60%. And then the last thing I want to add is that the last time Republican senators represented a majority of the U.S. population was in 1996. And it seems unlikely to flip anytime soon.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like tyranny of the minority is a good way to describe it. And it's becoming a more entrenched and more powerful minority with each passing year.
Yeah, I understand the frustration. I share it in many respects. I do not see that minority knuckling under and giving way to the will of the majority. I think I see them holding on to the authority that they do have with a desperate grip because they know once they lose it, they're never getting it back.
Yeah. You may be right, but I prefer to see U.S. history, and this is wishful thinking perhaps, but a lot of the trends in U.S. history, the good guys are slowly winning.
Sure.
The culture war and the political wars are slowly being won, whether it come to voting rights or representation, gay rights, etc. The tide is slowly turning on all those fronts, and I would like to believe it's also going to turn on this front, that the United States may someday actually be represented by its majority, and whoever wins the popular vote becomes the president. What a concept, yeah. Right? And that territories like D.C. and Puerto Rico that are taxed without representation will indeed get representation.
Well, I don't disagree with you. You see states that would have been deeply red in the past, like Georgia, now starting to tip in the direction of blue, and it's largely because of urbanization.
Yes.
Cities like Atlanta getting large enough to offset the rural areas. You can see Texas,
yes,
even Texas, getting to the point where it's not out of the question for a Democratic candidate to win statewide office.
Yes.
And so if you see this as a trend line that's going to continue, and I personally do, urbanization pulling residents from the country into the city, and in the city people are exposed to new ideas, and they become comfortable with minorities, and they become comfortable with progressive ideas. The trend line is in the direction of what you and I would both like to see, which is a federal government and more state governments that represent the majority rather than the minority.
Yeah. But as you pointed out, the immediate battleground is going to be in the Senate, and it's going to have to mean overcoming the filibuster, which is going to mean we need to add Democratic senators. And that's going to be difficult because a Democrat will never get elected in Idaho or Wyoming. So Democrats are going to have to win every open seat in a state where they can plausibly get the majority of votes. And that's going to be a tall order.
I think my overall philosophy is that the battle is as desperate as it is today and as mean-spirited in many respects because one side sees that it is losing long-term and it's getting desperate because of that. And that's bad in the short term, but reason for optimism in the long term.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. That's what I meant before. That liberals and progressives are winning the culture war and the war for the soul of the country. That sounds corny, but I believe it. And when the rat gets cornered is when it fights most angrily, most dangerously. And I feel like the right wing in this country, they're the cornered rats. They know they're losing. They're fighting a rear guard action on all these things. And we can only hope that we live to see the kind of progress that is necessary in this country.
Yeah. But in the meantime, did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did. Thank you. And forgive me for doing more pontificating than I usually do. But this issue gets me wound up in knots. And, I really feel like there's a clear right answer here. It's frustrating that we just can't get there.
Yeah. Well, I respect your passion. Are you ready for your question for next time?
I am, yes. Lay it on me.
So every now and then over the past few years, I've seen a headline asking the question, should we treat aging as a disease? Part of me wants to roll my eyes at this and ask why it is that so many people seem so unwilling to accept their own mortality. But on the other hand, I can't help but wonder, are there certain aspects of aging that we've long assumed be inevitable that are in fact treatable conditions? So I put the question to you, Joe. Should we, in fact, be treating aging as a disease?
Wow. Okay. Interesting. I'm already thinking the first thing I'm going to do is look up the word disease, and that's going to be part of the presentation, I think. Definition of disease.
Okay, go to the Merriam-Webster dictionary and find out how it's described.
Yes. Okay, I'll get on that. I'll look forward to talking to you about it in a few weeks. Okay, folks, this is the part of the show where we ask you to help us out by giving us a review or a rating wherever you get this podcast and checking out our Facebook page, which is Mansplaining the Podcast. You can look at our sources there. You can leave a comment or a question about what you just heard. You can also suggest topics for future episodes. Maybe you want to start a movement to have mansplaining become the next state of the union. And then Mark and I would be the obvious choices for the senators.
The two residents of mansplaining would also be the two votes in the Senate.
Exactly. I mean, I'm open to that possibility. And this is the place where that movement would start, on our Facebook page, when you rate our podcast wherever you receive this podcast. That's the place to start the momentum.
Yes, it's a patriotic act.
Yes. So please do that, and we pay attention to it, and we will certainly get back at you if you are so inclined. But that's a wrap for this episode. That was Mark. I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.